speeches. As a result, Tagore's message of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had a friendlier reception in Japan than in China. There was a painter called Sugata Bose who had the privilege of being hosted by Taikan in Japan. In fact, there is a beautiful sketch by Nandolal, which I haven't brought for you today, unfortunately, of Tagore in Penang. It's a lovely sketch, and you might want to find it. Now, in 1924, there was another important visit by Sun Yat-sen of China to Japan, and he made a very major speech in Kobe in November of 1924. And there are deep similarities between what Tagore had said in mid-1924 and Sun Yat-sen said in Japan in late 1924. Sun Yat-sen actually referred to a book by an unnamed American scholar. Now that scholar happens to be a man called Lothrop Stoddard, who had a BA and a PhD from Harvard University. But this was an era of Asian exclusion in the United States. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was passed, which was popularly referred to as the Orientals Exclusion Act. And Stoddard's books had contributed to this kind of exclusionary politics. He had first written a book in 1920, which was called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And Mark Mazawa, the historian at Columbia University, has noted how it really captured the international mood in the West at that time. And then in 1922, he wrote another book called The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman. And Sun Yat-sen said in response that this American scholar regards the awakening of Asia to be a revolt against civilization. And using that as a point of departure, Sun Yat-sen talked about how there were civilizations and civilizations. And he advocated the kingly way rather than the despotic way. The kingly way of sharing power, spreading beneficence instead of tyranny and so forth. And he asked the Japanese to make a choice. Do they want to pursue the spirit of Asian universalism, or will they imitate European nationalistic imperialism? Now, if the streams of Asian universalism and communist internationalism diverged from 1927 onwards, and this has been shown by Tim Harper, who was here just last week in his book, Underground Asia, the intermingling of Asian and Islamic universalisms had a much longer afterlife than might have been expected following the Turkish abolition of the Khilafat in 1924. And no one gave more eloquent expression to a different universalism of Muslims in South and West Asia than the great poet philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who attended the second Mu'tamar al-Alam al-Islami in Jerusalem in November of 1931. Of course, Palestine dominated the discussions because the Palestinians had already started to lose their lands to Zionists at that point. What Iqbal argued in 1931 was that the spectre of pan-Islamism had been conjured up in the fertile imagination of a lone French journalist. And Iqbal proposed dropping the pan from the phrase as Islamism sufficed. And much the same can be said at this time about the needless prefix attached to the sentiments of Asianism. Now, if you think about the 1930s, it was a decade of a worldwide economic depression. And many of the movements, the mobility of people that had taken place across Asia was arrested, if not reversed, in that period. There was a collapse in agricultural prices, there was a drying up of credit, and so on. And yet, there were Asian women's conferences being held in that decade, Asian labor congresses being convened, and so forth. And what we also see in this period is how there were European-style nationalist conflicts that came to afflict Asia. And the most important of these, of course, was Japan's invasion of the Chinese mainland in 1937. And so what we see, this is of course Iqbal in Jerusalem. There were African American intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who came in 1936 to Japan and China. And he did not fully condemn Japan's aggression because he had a realist political analysis of the situation in Asia and suggested that Japan had to be assertive if Euro-America was not to take over China. And he basically thought in terms of the unity of oppressed peoples across the entire world. But then in India, where there were many figures who had really admired China, admired Japan from the turn of the 20th century, who decided that their sympathies lay with China in 1937, 1938. So here you see a picture of Subhas Chandra Bose sending off the Indian medical mission from Calcutta. And in the next picture, you see these Indian doctors with Mao Zedong in Yan'an in early 1939. And there had been a deep friendship between the two poets, Rabindranath Tagore and Yuane Noguchi, going back to the early 20th century. But they had something of a falling out in 1938 because of their differing interpretations of the Japan-China conflict. In November 1935, Noguchi had been given a warm reception in Shantiniketan by Tagore. But then there was an exchange of letters that took place in 1938, which I discuss in this book. It was about this time, well, a little later, in 1940, that the famous Chinese painter Xu Beihong came and spent time in Shantiniketan and interacted with the artists there. Here is his portrait of Tagore. He also did a wonderful sketch of Gandhi. The expression on Gandhi's face has hardly been better captured by an artist than in this one by Xu Beihong. But he did portraits but also landscapes. He then traveled to Darjeeling. He went and painted the Kanchenjunga, the Himalayas, as viewed from Darjeeling. In the period of war and famine, which I discuss in great detail in this book, the artistic milieu in Shantiniketan had to respond to these multiple crises. And here you see a painting by Nandalal Bose titled Annapurna. In a combination of tempera and Japanese wash, Nandalal created the haunting image of Annapurna and Rudra in 1943. In this famine, well over 3 million people died, even though there was no aggregate food shortage. Annapurna, who is seated on a lotus, holds a bowl of rice in her hands. Before her stands Shiva, reduced to a skeleton, holding a begging bowl. While famine was ravaging Bengal, Subhas Chandra Bose had arrived in Southeast Asia. This is the 5th of July, 1943, where in Singapore, in front of the City Hall, he's taking the salute as Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army, and in front of him on the Padang, there were 12,000 soldiers of the Azad Hind Force. I discuss the war period in great detail, and one of the themes that I focus on is how Asian freedom movements got to know one another better during this particular period, especially between 1943 and 1945. And here you see Subhas Chandra Bose in Rangoon. In fact, he arrived in Singapore and then he traveled all across Malaya. He electrified audiences and with his call for total mobilization. And he visited Thailand, and then he was in Burma by late July and early August of 1943 when this particular photograph was taken. Subhas Chandra Bose knew that so far as India and Japan were concerned, poetry and paintings had been very much a part of the relationship that had been forged since the turn of the 20th century. So even in the middle of a world war, when he was in Tokyo in November 1943, he made it a point to visit the Ueno Museum of Art. And here he is with Abid Hassan, who was his only Indian companion on the submarine voyage from Europe to Asia, and Ananda Mohan Sahai, who was actually a close colleague of Rash Bihari Bose in the Indian Independence League. There they are with Netaji viewing Japanese art in 1943. Now, after the end of the war, the idea of building an Asian federation was still alive. Our grandfather, Sharath Chandra Bose, travelled to Rangoon and met Aung San in July of 1946, and both articulated their visions of an Asian federation in the not so distant future in a public gathering in Rangoon City Hall. And this was soon followed by what has already been mentioned, the Asian Relations Conference. In fact, it was presided over by Sarojini Naidu, and she is the one who made the most eloquent speeches there. And she said, who wants a uniform culture? Who wants a monotonous culture? So she was a quintessential, colorful cosmopolitan, a patriot, but at the same time arguing that one can build a larger Asian cultural ecumene and a political federation. She too talked the language of an Asian federation in 1947. And of course, as was mentioned by Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, Gandhi was there at the Asian Relations Conference, and there were many Asian leaders who got an opportunity to meet him in person less than a year before he was tragically assassinated. There were many unofficial and semi-official Asian conferences that were held in many different parts of Asia in the course of the 1950s. This was a replica of a mural by Diego Rivera, Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace, that adorned the backdrop of a Beijing meeting for an Asia-Pacific Peace Conference. And even though politics was discussed, the Malayan emergency figured, prominently in the discussions at that time. But there were informal opportunities for intellectuals and artists to talk to one another. One of the delegates who had gone to Beijing for this particular conference was the artist Maqbool Fida Hussain. And he was a great admirer of Chibai Shi, whom he described as the Matisse of Asia, the master of ink painting in China. And the other artist whom he really admired was Shu Bei Hong, none other than the person who had spent time in Shantiniketan. He went to Shu Bei Hong's studio and was absolutely mesmerized by Shu Bei Hong's 1,000 horses. And that is what inspired Hussain to lend new vigor to his own horses from that time onwards. So what we find at this time is that artistic genius had vaulted across the Himalayas. But less than a decade after this kind of an expression of bonhomie, India and China would be fighting a border war in the Himalayas. And this is a photograph I took of the Sila, a pass in Arunachal Pradesh, where some of the conflict played out in 1962. And I have an interpretation as to why this happened. How post-colonial states, instead of drawing on the best in anti-colonial Asian thought, decided to hold on to European notions of unitary sovereignty and hard borders. And this is what led to war and conflict in this particular period. And yet, even at the moment of this of rivalry and conflict between nation states, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, evocatively called in a 1960 lecture, Asia as Method. In the early 1960s, Nandalal Bose, who had accompanied Tagore on his Asian voyage in 1924, celebrated the Indian countryside in his art in the Japanese sumie style. And of course, Japan continues to inspire art across Asia even today. Here is a recent luminous example titled The Bridge from Shahid Jalal's exhibition, Memories of Japan, that opened in Lahore in May 2022. So this landscape, which I think of as an Asian landscape, is what I try to write about in my book. I will conclude by saying that I have chosen to shift from an academic prose in the early part of my book to some personal reflections in the later chapters. And that is because I felt that I needed to ask and address the question that, what should we choose from legacies of the past in our uncertain journey ahead as Asians? And in this context, I will just end by reading, I look at the most recent period, both in economic terms and political and cultural dimensions as well, the period from 1979 onwards, which is often referred to as the period of the rise of Asia. And I have my own interpretation of this particular rise. But I'll end, because I'm standing here in Malaysia, by reading a paragraph from my book, which draws on a beautiful travelogue cum history by our mother, Krishna Bose, titled Choronorekhatobo, Your Footprints. And this will probably be a good link between the first and second sessions that have been planned for today. Both our parents, Shishir Kumar Bose and Krishna Bose, had come to Malaysia in 1979. They travelled to Singapore, Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok. So let me pick up where they talk about Kuala Lumpur. My mother writes, and in Kuala Lumpur, the veterans of the INA gathered for a lunch meeting in a restaurant called The Bangles to relive their wartime adventures with their Indian guests. Datin Janaki Thevar Athinahappan, who as a teenager had donated her earrings and bangles and gone with the Rani of Jhansi regiment to Burma, narrated her experiences of the retreat with Netaji from Rangoon in April 1945. Americ Singh Gill had landed as a secret agent of the INA by submarine in India and recalled his escape from a prison van in Calcutta after receiving a death sentence in a secret trial by the British upon capture. And I must say that I'm very glad that these martyrs, nearly 24 of them who were executed, are being remembered in Malaysia today. Satyavati Thevar Naidu, who commanded the Singapore unit of the Women's Regiment after Lakshmi Swaminathan moved forward to Burma, had by now lost her sight. But tears flowed from her sightless eyes when she met the Boses at dinner. Janaki sang a patriotic song composed by Qazi Nazrul Islam that Netaji had taught the leading figures of the women's movement. The song was Durgamogiri Kantar Muru Dustar Parabar. The visiting Indians were bombarded with questions at a press conference by journalists of the Malaysia New Straits Times, the Malay Mail, and other newspapers. In a sign of the New Times, Chen Tiu Yang of the Malay Mail asked whether Asian history was being properly written. Mostly Western scholars were writing Asian history. Could they have any empathy with Asia's freedom struggle? And even if they did, was it possible for those from another culture to offer a correct interpretation? Indians in Malaysia, despite being a minority, had acquired a measure of economic prosperity and political power. A mass meeting was held one day at the headquarters of the Malay Indian Congress. An announcement by a cabinet minister, Datun Samivelu, that the new auditorium being built by the Congress would be named after Netaji drew thunderous applause from the gathering. Indians in Thailand were as enthusiastic as their counterparts in Malaysia about the wartime anti-colonial movement. The Thai Bharat Cultural Lodge provided the venue for a large meeting with veterans of the freedom struggle led by Ishwar Singh Narula, who along with Devnath Das had represented Thailand's Indian community in the Azad Hind government. Netaji last visited Bangkok on August 16-17, 1945. Krishna Bose learned with profound regret that a perfectly good plan for Bose to go underground in Thailand was rejected for a far riskier one as the war wound down to a close. Now, there is no question that in the 4 decades from 1979 to 2019, there has been an unmistakable economic rise of Asia, and the global balance of power that had shifted against Asia in the early 19th century has at least been partially redressed. But what do we do with this rise? And here I will go back to Rabindranath Tagore, who during a visit to Iran in 1932 had pondered over the prospect of the rise of Asia. He wrote, "We are the people of Asia. Grievances against Europe are in our blood." That's because of what Europe had done to Asia from the late 18th century onwards. If a new age has dawned in Asia, let Asia give it utterance in a new, authentic voice. If instead Asia merely imitates Europe's beastly cry, were it even to be the lion's roar, it will be a loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Sugata Bose, for the descriptive and enlightening talk, which ended most beautifully and nostalgically with the read from your book. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Dr. Rajarasaya to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you. In contrast to the disappointment that Professor Sugata Bose expected from a so-called economist, I must say I was fascinated. Although I did formal history until 15, they formed 3 equivalent in Malaysia. But it's just like, I've even quoted, I think Suratna will know that, Utsapan Naik's work, where she actually mentions that the British took away something like 45 trillion US dollars while they colonized India from 1765. So, yeah. And so, I must say, I think most of them here are fascinated that this set of historical lenses used to capture the intellectual, cultural, and political conversation. I thought it was really interesting. And I think a person I remembered when you said that is Surbaratnam's late wife. In the launching of her book on art, she actually says the same thing. She actually says the same thing, art should be understood through music, through painting, and a whole range of other things. And that's the sort of thing I heard from you, and thank you on that. We don't really have time, but it's already past 5 now. I shall open for 2 questions, but remember that although this topic seemingly did not appear to bring Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, but we already heard the conversations documented by Professor Sugata Bose that dabbled on a number of things he's done, including his scintillating speech in the Padang in Singapore, the great oratorship that he showed. So we can actually have most of the questions after the second question, since it's very much time. So can we have, in case, yeah, Hamdan, if you have to leave.
Well, I think it's a wonderful, what I call journey through time, and connecting both in terms of the deep intellectual connections expressed through ideas and art. I wanted to, while you have written about Asia after Europe, someone prior, Ken Chowdhury, had written Asia before Europe. And the whole thesis of that was about trade and civilization in the Indian Ocean. And I think your prior work also had touched some aspects of this, in a sense that we've seen what they call the importance of a larger trading system that had existed prior to Europe's presence. As the world shifts, sure, as the world shifts, as we see now, with shift in terms of a relationship between the US and China and others, will there be a much stronger Asia response? Because currently there is a kind of you can call it intellectual vacuum that is not present in Asia in terms of the likes of what you have mentioned, of the personalities. So I don't know your thoughts.
Yeah, second question and answer to that.
Any questions?
Because we don't have time.
Yes.
So we can
Just one more question.
Yeah, that's okay. We can have the questions.
We can have the questions after the second session, as
Really
Raja Rasaya has mentioned. So let me address Hamdan's very, very pertinent question. The title of my book, Asia After Europe, is a deliberate play on K.N. Chowdhury's classic work, Asia Before Europe. Now, most historians of the Indian Ocean and Asian connections had concentrated on the pre-modern and the early modern period. K.N. Chowdhury's book, among others, ends around 1750 or at most 1800. He looks at the millennium from the rise of Islam up to about 1750 or 1800. And in an earlier book, 100 Horizons, I had actually tried to take forward Indian Ocean history into the 19th and 20th centuries. And so, in some ways, my method echoes that of K.N. Chowdhury, whom Shumantra and I met in Avignon only last month in June, in the sense that I try to somehow blend the study of political economy and culture in this work, Asia After Europe. I use this phrase, Asia After Europe, in at least two senses. First, of course, I'm writing about Asia as a connected zone after the imposition of European imperial domination. Particularly, I would say you can date it to the second decade of the 19th century. That is when you have the great divergence in the economic fortunes of Europe and Asia. There was nothing ancient about Asia's poverty. And in fact, P.N. Chaudhary, among others, had showed how economically dynamic the entire Indian Ocean interregional arena had been up to that point. So in a chronological sense, I'm talking about Asia after Europe. But much more importantly, I'm trying to advance a conceptual argument about the possibility of an Asia after Europe. Asian conceptions of universalism and cosmopolitanism, which are very different from European conceptions of reason and national identity. And the point that you made was raised yesterday as well in Singapore by Kishore Mahabubani, that in political and economic terms, there has unquestionably been a rise of Asia. There has been a redressal of the global imbalance that began in the early 19th century. But we seem to have had greater intellectual figures arguing a case for Asianism or a spirit of Asian universalism with very different views on sovereignty and borders and so on, calling into question the nation state as the normative political unit in the colonial era, in the, for example, early 20th century, than we seem to have today. My only hope is that with books of the kind that I have written, that there will be a younger generation of Asians who will be inspired to provide the intellectual leadership, which in fact seems to be sadly missing at a very critical moment when the global balance of power is shifting in favor of the erstwhile colonized Asia. Thank you.
I think now I pass the cue back to the MC to close the current session, and then we'll come back to the second session.
Thank you, Professor. I'd now like to invite Professor Dr. Rajarasia to present a token of appreciation from the Asia-Europe Institute to Professor Dr. Sugata Bose. I'd also like to call upon Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, Founder President of the Malaysia India Heritage Society, to receive one from Professor Dr.